Is autism a disability? Well, like everything in autistic life, it's nuanced. Let's chat about it. Hi, I'm Phil, a late diagnosed autistic older adult, and it's my goal to advocate for autistic people by spreading positive information about autism and by sharing a few of my own stories along the way. Last time we spoke about ableism and internalised ableism and how other people can make the lives of autistic people harder through the way they think about and act towards autistic people, and also how these negative and ignorant views can rub off on autistic people, leading to unhelpful or destructive self-views and internal self-talk. This time I want to add some more context around that discussion by asking the question, is autism a disability? After all, if we are trying to create a positive image around autism, why would we add a further label that may have negative connotations? And maybe disability is not how all autistic people view their experience. Let's take a systematic approach and break it down. So first up, let's define disability. If we just type disability into a search engine, we get the definition: a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses or activities, and a disadvantage or handicap, especially one imposed or recognised by the law. Okay, that probably makes sense and reflects how most people might think about disability, but it is a fairly crude and stereotyped definition. So let's go a layer deeper and have a look at how the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities defines disability. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Okay, now we're starting to see a bit more nuance and application to the definition. So I guess the first point to make here is that how we define something has a huge impact on how we approach it from an internal or personal perspective. The internet search engine definition paints a picture that is focused on the restrictions of the person. Using words like limits and handicap and legal imposition creates a narrative of deficit. In other words, the person is disabled because they are defective or missing some crucial element that makes the person whole or even truly human. This approach is often referred to as the medical model of disability. This approach focuses on the things that hold the person back and suggests that the disability is inherently bad or negative. Disability is something that you should not want. Disability is in you and it's your problem. This then leads to the narrative that curing people with disabilities or making them less disabled will lessen the problem. Thus, a professional is the only person who can help. Basically, disability is your problem, and if you want to take your place in society, you need to somehow make it better. In other words, your problem, your responsibility. Okay, so we have probably all grown up thinking about disability in ways such as this, viewing it as inherently bad and something to fear and avoid. I know for me when I was young, I had a deep fear of anyone who might have a disability. I had no concept of how to relate to anyone who might be different and actively avoided such interactions. I have to chuckle at this now, as life has a way of bringing our deepest fears to the forefront. And I've spent the bulk of my adult life working with and advocating for people with disabilities and living with disability without even understanding that about myself. So let's, for a moment, return to the United Nations definition of disability and see how that description takes a fundamentally different approach from the web search result. First up, it still acknowledges that people with disabilities have impairments, but immediately goes on to say, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. This second part of the definition is the key and flips the whole conversation on its head. Yes, the person with a disability has impairments, but it's the barriers that hinder the person's participation in society. So straight away, the responsibility is no longer placed on the shoulders of the person with a disability, but rather on the society in which they exist. This is known as the social model of disability. This also gives nuance to the difference between impairment and disability. Impairment is the physical attribute, but disability is created when society fails to include that person because of their impairment. Now, a brief extra point here also. The word impairment might be better replaced with the word difference. Impairment still retains that negative connotation, as it is a value judgment on the person's ability, but we will return to that a bit later. When we extend the concept that it is society's responsibility to minimise barriers for people with disabilities, we naturally approach concepts like inclusion and accessibility. Accessibility is the bridge to remove the barriers that the person with a disability might face. Common examples of accessibility are ramps for building access for people with mobility impairments, large print, braille or audio material for people with print disabilities, signing or hearing loops for deaf people and people with hearing impairments, and many more that we are happily now used to seeing in the world around us. All these practices lead to the inclusion of people with disabilities who experience these various impairments or differences. Now, a further note on language here. Many autistic people prefer to use identity-affirming language over person-first language, or in other words, use the word autistic rather than a person with autism. As we have stated before, this is a personal preference and each person's choice here should be respected. What might not be so obvious is that when it comes to describing disability more generally, person-first language is being more widely accepted within the disability community. So we would say a person with a disability rather than a disabled person. The reason for this is that the person is a person first and foremost who has a disability, and the disability does not define the essence of that person. This is the opposite to how many autistic people see themselves, in that we often feel that our autism is so intrinsic to who we are that it forms the core of our identity, and thus we are an autistic person. And a further extension of this language around disability is that the word handicapped is no longer used, as it implies that something is wrong with that person, whereas disability is a more neutral term, meaning a person does not have certain abilities. And to put it more plainly, handicapped has taken on a more offensive nature as a description. Each sector of the disability community will have its own preference around language, and this may change with region. For instance, the deaf community also typically prefer identity-first language, but people with physical or mobility disability would, in the modern context, typically find outdated words like crippled or deformed inappropriate or even offensive. And using the word normal to describe someone who does not have a disability also implies people with disabilities are abnormal, which is degrading. I know I have done that in this podcast on occasions and maybe have not adequately inferred that the use of normal is in inverted commas to indicate that it is how most people might think. So I will try to improve on that in the future also. Okay, so how does all this relate back to autism and indeed neurodivergence more generally? The first thing to note again goes back to the fundamental point of language. Autism is diagnosed as a list of deficits. Now this is a problem right at the outset. The language of deficit is firmly entrenched in the medical model of disability and the assumption that these deficits are inherently bad. Even the official diagnosis reads autism spectrum disorder, again pointing to that medical model with its implied negative value judgment. This medical approach also leads many people to believe that autism is like some disease or illness. But, and very damaging here, is the logical next step that this language implies, is that diseases can often be cured. So there springs the scientifically incorrect and very damaging narrative of seeking a cure for autism. This is pushed by some disreputable organisations and sleazy politicians looking to capitalise on societal ignorance to push false agendas. And the damage caused is real for both autistic people, who get pushed down due to being re-stigmatised, but also to the parents of autistic children, who are high support needs, often with severe autistic traits and co-occurring intellectual disability. This false narrative about a cure for autism leads these people on, often with the goal of gaining donations from them to the benefit of these organisations or for political point scoring. Autism is not a disease, it's a lifelong developmental difference. Autistic people have a brain that has developed differently from the neurotypical norm. Once this neurological profile is set, that's who we are for life. And that is okay. So there is nothing to cure. If you prefer dogs to cats, you can't just cure a cat of its catness to turn it into a dog. Much better to understand the positives about cats and love cats in all their wonderful catness. Yep, I like cats and dogs and possums, kangaroos, birds, lizards, wombats. Now, where was I? Oh yes. And likewise, in the modern context, we think much more neutrally about autism as being a difference rather than a disorder or impairment. But this difference language does not reduce the disability reality. As we discussed earlier in the social model of disability, it is how society responds to these differences that determine how disabled a person might be, due to the lack of accessible options or even the downright exclusion of the person. Autism and neurodivergence more generally, as we have said, is a differently constructed brain. This leads to differences in thinking, differences in how we respond to others, and differences in how our bodies physically react to the world around us. Now let's be frank, the world hates difference. So when we show up with all of our wonderful autisticness, most people don't know how to handle that. Whether it's how we might interact and communicate in unexpected ways, or whether it's been uncomfortable at our need to stim or move. We often find that we might be excluded or ignored, and this goes to the very heart of the UN definition of disability that we went through earlier. The upshot of all this is that autism often gets responded to from the standpoint of the medical model of disability. Over the last several decades, the world has gotten much better at approaching disability from a social model perspective, where those disabilities are more accepted. But there is still a way to go for autism to reach that same level of acceptance. An example here is that autistic people are often overlooked for accommodations, whether that's in school, the workplace, or healthcare. The autistic person, who might be overwhelmed by noise, might still be required to work in a noisy open-plan office environment, or need to bring their own noise-cancelling headphones to cope with the auditory overstimulation. The "it's your issue, you deal with it" approach. This is like saying to a wheelchair user, if you can't use the stairs to get into the building, you either need to bring your own ramp or get out of your chair and crawl up the stairs, dragging your wheelchair behind you. Now, this is absurd and offensive to even suggest because it seems so obviously wrong and inequitable. But because the barriers for the autistic person are not so obvious, most people would not see any equivalence between the examples. This is where we start to see that autism is not only disabling due to the lack of societal inclusion and understanding, but that this disability is also hidden, making the consequences a double impact. So you might hear the term hidden disability in reference to autism, and likewise for ADHD and dyslexia as well. Now, outside the factors relating to how autistic might be disabled by societal response, there are also some very distinct attributes of autism that may be disabling in their own right. Some examples here might include some of the following. Autistic people of all support levels may sometimes or even often experience occasions when our language shuts down. This might be in times of severe dysregulation or stress. For me, this happens when trying to communicate in a situation where emotions might be running high, or I need to convey a very important message that might even be about my own self-advocacy or well-being. And yes, this has happened to me in the workplace, in an important meeting where I've lost speech. In these situations, the autistic person has a significant barrier that is disabling, as the people around us might then believe we have nothing to say and dismiss us, leading to poor outcomes for us. We might actually have plenty to say, but be physically incapable of speech at that time. An extension of this point is where we might need to physically retreat from a situation because of overwhelm or overstimulation. Again, in a workplace, this can lead to the assumption that we have disengaged or just don't care, leading to negative consequences. This is an example of how autism is disabling in terms of interactions with others. The ebb and flow of energy within any autistic person can also be disabling. Some days we might be full steam ahead and achieve great outcomes, complete projects and meet deadlines. On another day, or maybe the day after we were hyperproductive, we might crash and need to spend time away from other people. This inconsistency in energy can be significantly disabling as we miss opportunities or maybe have to pull out of prior commitments, leading to potential negative judgments from others, but maybe more significantly the harsh internalised judgments we place on ourselves at these times. The result of all this can be depression, anxiety and of course burnout. These are disabling in their own right, but when you add the fact that this is a regular cycle for many autistic people, even without the societal factors, the effects of the autistic experience can be disabling. Extending this a layer deeper is the sensory experience of most autistic people. Just about every aspect of the modern world we inhabit can send any autistic person into overstimulation, from lights and movement to the noise that is constant in the 21st century, to the wide landscape of smells, both artificial and from the people around us. This overstimulation of the senses can cause us to shut down, need to escape or even melt down, all rendering us incapable of continuing in the moment whatever it was that we were trying to accomplish. And that accomplishment might have been something as simple as going to the shops to buy food to live. In this example, the disabling effects impact directly on achieving the fundamentals of survival. A further point about the autistic sensory experience that might not be so obvious to many people is the difference between our internal and external sensory world. We often find our external senses get maxed out and overstimulated, whereas our internal senses may be almost completely inaccessible to us. Things like hunger, thirst, temperature regulation, emotions, etc. This dichotomy between internal and external sensory experience can also be highly energy depleting. And of course, there is the fact that many autistic people experience some form of self-harm. For me, this often happens in meltdowns where I might injure myself either unintentionally or through actions like head hitting, which may appear intentional, but in that moment of extreme overwhelm are reactive and unplanned. The unintentional self-harm in these instances can even be as simple as tensing of muscles in that peak moment. This could lead to muscle injury, or as I've experienced, extreme mouth clenching causing broken fillings or chipped teeth. And then there is autistic empathy, which can be so strong for us that we might become overwhelmed in our empathic mirroring of the emotions of other people around us or the plights of other people. While this trait is indeed a positive in autistic people, it may even cause us to shut down because of the extremity of this response. And of course, one of the most significant multipliers when it comes to how disabling our autism might be on a day-to-day basis is where our health journey is at that point in time. If either our physical or mental health is struggling, then we might find that aspects of our daily autistic experience that normally would be manageable might tip into being disabling. And all of these things may impact our ability to maintain work or even social interactions with the people who are important to us, potentially disrupting our support structures. When we lose work or the capacity to work, the impact on our financial resources also mean we have less opportunity for other things. So the disabling aspects leading to this outcome also lead to disadvantage. So through all of these examples, we can see that the autistic experience can be by its very nature disabling. But is autism a disability for all autistic people all of the time? And here is where we might start to find some nuance in the discussion. While autism is obviously disabling in so many ways, we must also acknowledge that autistic people have many strengths and truly positive characteristics. We have spoken about these positive attributes many times, but a few examples at this point for those who might be new around here might include logical and rational thinking ability, creativity, ability to focus intently on the things that are important to us, focus on honesty, justice and values, empathy for others and loyalty. Some autistic people may be able to leverage these and many more strengths in their personal and work lives in such a way that their autism becomes more a strength than a disability. So for some, their autistic identity may not focus on disability as their personal experience. But I think for many of us, we most likely swing between both ends of the ability spectrum, of feeling disabled to feelings of heightened ability. And where we might be at any particular point in time in that pendulum swing often comes down to external factors, the people around us, and how we are being impacted on by the wider society. This brings us back full circle in that if we are well supported, included and not judged, if we are given opportunity and the demands placed upon us do not exceed our capacity to meet them, if our mental and physical health is stable and we have time to ourselves to recharge our energy, we might find the disabling aspects of autism are less evident. But if any of these supportive factors are missing, we may likewise find that the intensity of the disabling factors of autism itself, society, and the environment we inhabit may become many times more extreme. So what we can take from this is that support for all autistic people is crucial to be able to live and survive in this world, and that the disabling effects of autism will ebb and flow as life's stresses and our health also vary. And in summary, I would say that at least for me, my autism is disabling, but not all of the time. And at certain moments, it is truly wonderful to live within this autistic brain. So yes, autism is both disabling and yet leads me to positive personal identity, which talks to the nuance we discussed at the start. Okay, so that's it for now. If you're autistic, do you consider your autism to be a disability? And what do you wish society would understand about the disabling aspects of autism? And if you have another neurodivergence, I would love to hear how disability intersects with your journey as well. Please like and subscribe for more conversations and anecdotes from an older autistic bloke. And of course, share with anyone who might need some encouragement and assurance that they are valued, despite maybe being a bit different. Thanks again for watching. You are all awesome. See you next time.